I know I
Um,
was going to mess that part up because you talked about in it where she meets with a scientist and the scientist is like, I can't tell you this on the record, but there's new stuff
right,
coming.
right. Well, that's not the like disease is not like a disease is something you have that's bad. Whereas like there are a growing number of women who are getting this intentionally who want to be able to reproduce without men. So the new mother is the moment set at the moment where society is sort of first recognizing that the condition exists, and the novel is set right around the time where the demographic shift to majority women first starts to be felt.
So I'm totally going to fanboy geek out on this because some other stuff I thought of. First off, right, I actually did in grad school some study on genetic algorithms. One of the chair of the CS department was an anthropologist. So an interesting aspect of this in terms of evolution, right, is the normal way evolution works is you got like two sets of genes and they splice and you get some from the mom, some from the dad. Geneticists out there get upset with me for my stupidity talking like Sesame Street. But then you also have the possibility of mutation, just the gene randomly mutates and you get a change.
Right.
With this, you no longer have gene splicing essentially for evolution. You would just have mutation. And one of the things you were mentioning with the similarity is it seems like all of these girls are clones. So that seems like there is an implication there about the future of humanity in terms of like this also gets like using to your name like eugenics wise the notion of like gene strength and susceptibility to things like disease and plagues and like this notion of should these people be allowed, like now you've got questions like should these people be allowed to reproduce, right? Because normally they wouldn't have because they couldn't have found a partner. Now they can reproduce. You had someone in your book already do that or novella who already spayed, as you mentioned it, which was really weird comparing it to dogs, right? But who already went about his way to make certain women infertile because of this. Like the implications of that going forward to me seem huge.
Right. So eugenics is a big theme of the novel that I'm working on, which is nowhere near to it's very early stages. I'm probably very far from finishing this thing, but it's one of the things that I'm very interested in looking at and addressing in sort of the future of this world, and also like I'm interested in so a progressive movement starts. Eventually, it gets big enough that while still, dealing with problems, in-group, out-group dynamic problems, there's also sort of internecine strife and political difference and divergence of views within the group once it gets larger and its aims become more diverse. And so the interface between in-group and out-group and how complications within an in-group affects that interface is one of the things that I'm looking at with this novel. One of the plot threads takes place on an intentional community of parthenogenetic women. Another of the plot threads is looking at a terrorist group, basically a violent terrorist group that has arisen from the modern men's rights advocacy groups.
That's not like there's certain things that are science fiction-y and there's certain stuff where you're just like that seems true. I mean we're there, like that's the messed up part of like we're in a world where you have people. I talked a little bit about Anita Sarkeesian on my last podcast, the Box Score Geeks one, because I stole one of her quotes. It's both possible to basically enjoy something and realize it's problematic. But we already have groups where, I noticed she puts up a YouTube video and you have people that have 3 times the length of her video explaining everything wrong. And on its surface, there's not a problem with that. But there is a very interesting underpinning, especially when you talk terrorism, the notion of just shouting down anybody that talks up. And then how that starts very innocuous almost, right? Like I'm gonna make a 3-hour YouTube video explaining everything wrong with Anita Sarkeesian. I won't do that. I don't agree with that. And how that can grow into, well, it's justifiable for me to call a SWAT team on someone, or it's justifiable for me to completely release someone's public information to have them at risk for identity fraud and stuff like that. That very subtle line that's already there and we're already starting to see it's quite terrifying actually to observe.
So there's a terrorism researcher named Louise Richardson, Dr. Louise Richardson, and she says that for sort of terrorist groups to form, you need 3 things. You need a disaffected population, an enabling group, and a legitimizing ideology. Like these are the steps necessary for radicalization.
Can you explain that first one? I didn't quite understand it. The disaffected population.
Disaffected population. Well, I think that's just, when people are happy and comfortable, they are not moved to radicalize.
Okay.
Yeah. So a population that's in some way disaffected is one of the components here. And then you need a group that enables the radicalization and an ideology connecting the two that sort of legitimizes the process. And I feel like the current sort of men's rights advocacy movement has parts 2 and 3 already. They are the enabling group for people to radicalize, and they have a legitimizing ideology, which is that feminists are trying to take over. I just don't think that they're and they believe that they're disaffected. I just don't think they actually are. I think the reason that we haven't seen, other than that we haven't seen organized violence as opposed to unorganized violence already, is because, frankly, men still have it pretty damn easy.
I will actually argue back a little bit there, because this actually gets into a weird notion. I'm curious if this will come into your book, because you said it 20 years in the future.
Right. Well, this is the place where men are actually disaffected because their numbers are shrinking with respect to women, and if they get this condition, they become sterile. That's men who contract it can't father children. Man,
there's so many ways to go off on this. This, by the way, I'm going to give you an A+ in terms of good science fiction, because I find the best science fiction is the one that's not open and shut. It's where we're not going to talk it much. This is the homework. We're kind of starting to breach into the tangent territory of the podcast, but I'm going to keep us on track a little longer. But one of the books I think you recommended, or someone did, was Red Shirts. I'm going to talk that more. But there was a premise of that story that I was oh, that's pretty interesting. And as the book goes on, the premise keeps growing. And I'm this is growing beyond the scope of this book. This book is not going to be able to finalize the premise it has opened. And yours was the same way, where I'm the number of questions I have and the number of possible stories has far exceeded this. You said 20,000 word?
Yeah, it's about 20,000.
Has far exceeded this 20,000 word. And that's not a bad thing. That is a fantastic thing, because the worst kind of book are these ones where, they're simple, right? A lot of the television shows I following this theme, where it's premise, oh my gosh, we've got to get through this problem, conclusion, everything's wrapped up with a nice bow, see you next week.
Yeah, so yours return to status quo at the end of the episode.
Exactly. And yours does this fantastic, where it just opens up. But the question I have being the internet versus reality, where people still view these as different things. We're getting to a point where how you're able to harm someone on the internet, when you said disorganized violence, we've had, in case of men's rights activist groups, very organized attacks, but they're on the internet. And the implications of that going forward, because I would argue the amount of harm they've done to prominent feminists is up there with if, they had firebombed their house in reality. Sorry to open that Pandora on this podcast.
That's an interesting. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, no one's been murdered yet.
Which is a small. Yeah, I mean that's.
And to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a targeting of the unaffiliated to send a message to a wider group, something like suicide bombing, or terrorism is the targeting of civilians to send a message, third-party civilians to send a message to your actual opponent.
Okay, I get that.
Whereas, if a men's rights advocate went and firebombed a girls' school to say, you see women, you see what's coming to you if you don't get back in line, I would say that was a terrorist act.
I would still argue there's definitely some level of cyber terrorism we could talk there, because they've done some of the stuff they've gotten to has gotten to a level where I'm scared, to be candid.
I've been doing a lot of research on terrorism for this novel.
Okay.
Honestly,
love it.
I am unpersuaded of the usefulness of the term cyber terrorism.
Okay, I'm not even saying it's a usefulness. I'm just curious about that.
I'm not sure cyber terrorism. If cyber terrorism is a thing, I think it's a thing that hasn't been done yet. I think cyber terrorism would be something shutting down the power grid somewhere because you don't like the country's foreign policy. That would seem to me to be cyber terrorism. But doxing someone or swatting someone, that's an act of violence towards a person. So a lot of the last 15 years of policy, which I found very troubling, like especially during as a left-leaning individual during the Bush administration, was the sort of use of the word terrorism to justify basically any action. We have to do this because terrorism. And it seems to me that if I'm going to be critical of attempts to justify a war in Iraq on the basis of terrorism, when there was no connection between Iraq and 9/11 or any terrorist attack against the United States, if I'm going to be sort of critical of that kind of sloppy rhetorical stance, then I need to be careful about what terrorism means when I use the term as well. And just because I disagree and find abhorrent, appalling the actions that these men are taking towards people like Anita Sarkeesian, terrorism is not a synonym for any abhorrent, violent act. And I can recognize things as abhorrent and violent without sort of continuing to adulterate this term. So I think that for something to be terrorism, it has to be politically motivated, but it also has to be the targeting of civilians as an act of is sort of a violent communicative act towards a third party, not the people that you're targeting. I think that's what terrorism is.
And I think it's actually terrifying that you're putting this as a premise where, like I said, I don't think that's that off the mark from where things are kind of heading.
No, that's when I first came up with this a few years ago. I thought, oh, here's a neat speculative conceit, and actually, it seems like maybe I was really optimistic saying this would take 20 years, but that's neither here nor there. I sincerely hope reality never catches up with my premise.
Well, I will say, again, more A+. I'm just going to keep fanboying out about your work and your stuff. Like, I really appreciate the level of both research you've done and introspection you've done on the subject, because I think that is there's a fantastic Cracked podcast that was up this week. As I mentioned, it's one of like the 4 subjects, Cracked and Malcolm Gladwell are 2 of them, that I can just talk at nauseum about. But they talked about deceitful documentaries. And what they mentioned is, these people have the best of intentions when they make documentaries, but the actual stuff they show is untrue, and they kind of justified it to themselves because, like Morgan Spurlock is one they bring up, where they say, supersize me is just untrue. Like the scientists have not been able to replicate the effects of McDonald's on his body the key point is over a 30-day period. Now, it's not to say McDonald's isn't unhealthy for you, and that's why Morgan Spurlock made the documentary, was to say McDonald's is unhealthy for you. But in his quest to try and say, see, this is bad, I've got to tell the world, I've got to get people to look up, he lied, and that made things problematic. And so that's one of the things you're talking about, in the book too, and you're talking like political rhetoric between people, where it's like when you're advocating something, you don't want to give anything up. You don't want to give the other side anything. So it gives you a thing. You don't want to say, well, I concede that. I mean, I found that even in sports, right? Like I'll have to be like, well, I concede this player is probably worse at defense than I think. Yeah. And the other side says, aha, see, you admit you're wrong. And I'm like, no, whatever. But it gets really hard when you're on the side of something to concede it. And like you're saying, you're actually doing the introspection, saying, this is how I feel. I think I like that we made it very clear to the audience. You're not behind any of the men's rights activists or the cyber, whatever you want to call it, the harassment, the massive, unacceptable harassment they've done of key feminist figures. But you said, if I'm going to talk about these acts and I'm going to view different crimes, I have to actually look at what that means. And I can't just go, because I think these people are evil, ergo I'm gonna call them anything if it means you can punish them. That's not the way to do things.
Right.
So, by the way, I think we're almost officially on tangent, but I want to ask you if you have anything, spoiler or not, you want to talk about The New Mother.
Here it is again. Please, everyone, buy it, read it, like it. If you do like it, tell me about it. It's a weird thing these days, publishing something in print, because so much content is available online for free. And I've published online and I've published in print, and the stories that I've published online have sort of continued to eventually just once in a while, like, get a reader who gets in touch with me or sort of get noticed years down the line. And the ones in print just kind of go away. And this is a story that that I put a lot of effort into, and that I would really like to not go away. So it's one of the reasons that I'm talking about it so much online, while you can still get it on the stores. I think the effect that you talked about, where you came away from it with a lot more questions, that was what I was going for. I wanted to write a story that would sort of expand in the mind. One of the nicest things anyone said about the story was someone who read it before it was published said that she was trying to talk about it with someone else, and they said, "You're talking about this like it's a thing that really happened, like it's a news story." And that's what I want. I want it to have sort of the chewy complexity of something that you'd hear on a news broadcast and have to figure out how that fits into your life and worldview. And that's what I've tried to do. And if that kind of sort of fictional endeavor sounds like your cup of tea, then I hope you check The New Mother out.
I will find a way, either via driving or plane, to end up in Austin. I want an autographed copy of the physical magazine. I actually may have to make sure I just go out and buy it, because I have the
I mean, I'll sign your Kindle if you want me to, but
yeah, I've had to do that a few times now, where I've bought physical copies of books to get real world authors to sign them. So I'm more than fine with doing that, though. But I always enjoy some tangent talk with you, because you're one of my favorite, one of the most knowledgeable people, as we've discussed in the past. EJ has this weird Venn diagram that happens to cross the social justice, science fiction, sports loving thing that I don't like. A lot of people cross some of those, but not all of them, which, that's what makes you a very interesting specimen as a person.
Well, thank you. I like to think myself an interesting specimen as a person.
You wrote a haiku. I'm gonna mispronounce his name.
Lyrical.
Yeah. So lyrical would work too. Yeah. You tell me his name, because I don't want to mispronounce it. John Scalzi, who wrote a book called Red Shirts, who I think you recommended I read. Maybe I forget who.
I don't remember that, but maybe I did. This is John Scalzi's Red Shirts.
Are you a Jim Gaffigan fan?
I know who he is, but I don't really know his stuff.
He's got a stand-up bit about having like books on your shelf. So I'm gonna out you right now, by the way. But he's like, about having books on your shelf you haven't read.
I have about 300 books I haven't read.
But points out the like absurdity of you visit someone's house, you're like, oh, that's a good book. They're like, I haven't read it. You're like, well, can I borrow it? You're like, nah, just gonna leave it there. But you have the book Red Shirts, so I'm gonna be like, you haven't read it, you cheater. But you had it on hand, which is impressive.
5 chapters. So here's what happened. John Scalzi, if you're listening, which you're definitely not, sorry, I haven't read it yet. So the first 5 chapters were posted on Tor.com, and I read those, which is also up through the chapter where I die. And what I mean when I say up through the chapter where I die is I am in this book, or perhaps my descendant is. My copy of Red Shirts right here, you will see, is inscribed by John Scalzi. And it says, "To E.J. Fischer, in memory of your doomed descendant, yours, John Scalzi." Because while he was writing this book, he had a haiku contest on his blog, where you had to write a haiku from someone who either was about to die or had just died. This was before people knew what the title of the book was and what it was about. And so in retrospect, it's obvious why he chose that option. But as someone who was either about to die or just died from spontaneous human combustion, poor GPS direction, lasers, or monkeys. And he got something around like 800 submissions of haikus about death from one or more of these things. And mine won. And so
by the way, I should have had this more prepared, but do you want to read it? I know you can probably get it up in front. I can. The
haiku is, "I did always hope my last moments would be spent somewhat coherent," which is a pun about lasers, and also about wanting to keep one's faculties throughout one's life. That one, and a character in here was named Lieutenant Fischer after me, and in, I think, Chapter 5, he gets eaten by swarm bots. And so obviously the book was over for me at that point. No, what actually happened was, as part of winning this contest, John said that he would send me a copy of the book. And so I eagerly waited for my copy of the book, and waited, and waited, and waited, and it never came. And then he was Toastmaster at the World Science Fiction Convention in Chicago. And I came up to him, and I said, "Hey, where's my copy of the book?" And he said, "Oh, I never got you one. This Did I? I'm going to find one for you, and get it to you. And then towards the end of the convention, he said, so this is, I suppose, in the category of good problems for an author to have, but we can't find one in the Chicago area that hasn't already been sold.
By the way, to make this even worse, right, you claimed, or I think in the contest, he said you'd get an acknowledgement in the author's notes. And I realized, like, when you told me this story, it didn't ring a bell. And I listened to the audio version. I was like, oh, I guess Will Wheaton didn't read the author's notes. And then you commented even further. You said, oh, he didn't put the author's note in.
Yeah, no, either. He also did not give me. Well, so technically he's got a cheat in the acknowledgments, right? Because the last bit of the acknowledgments says, and finally, thank you, dear reader. I'm glad you keep coming back for more. If you're hearing back, I'll keep writing them. That's a promise. And so technically, I am acknowledged in the acknowledgments in exactly the same way that we were all Time Magazine's Person of the year when the Person of the Year was you. But I was not. And he also never gave me a pony, which he initially suggested that he might, but then said he would not. So I can't really complain about that one. I don't really complain about any of these. The issue is, I did not buy a copy of the book when it was new and shiny and exciting because I was waiting to get one for free. And that took a year to happen. And by the time it got to me, my attention already shifted to other books. So I just haven't gotten back to it yet. I've got 300 unread books.
What I will say, I don't know what your thoughts, because I actually really love audiobooks. And this recent trip for me was interesting because I've been on like a nonfiction kick. And I think Red Shirts actually kicked me because it was on like Audible. And I was like, oh, I'll listen to this. And I really got into it. It's read by Will Wheaton, which makes it amazing. So like the audio version is actually quite compelling. So that's my advice: is listen to Will Wheaton talk about you die.
That would be interesting to hear Will Wheaton describe my death. That hadn't occurred to me. But no, I mean, I've got a copy of the book right here. But I think probably before I read that, I'll read his more recent one, Lock-In, which is also about sort of a science fictional disease. Just because I want to get, like, Red Shirts has already, won awards. It won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. It won the Hugo Award for Best Novel in my hometown, San Antonio. So, by the way, other authors out there, 100% of science fiction novels in which I appear have won the Hugo Award for Best Novel. Just saying.
Love it.
But the Lock-In will sort of be up for awards and consideration and things like that next year. And I want to be able to sort of have read it and consider it for that. So probably the next Scalzi book I'll read is Lock-In, and then I'll read Red Shirts. John has always, for the record, John has always been great to me. He's awesome. I love John.
Yeah.
But he did kill me, and for this there will be actually no retribution. It was a lot of fun.
I was going to say, you could have a character named Scalzi in your book.
I could. I should someday kill a Scalzi in one of my books.
Or what would be better is you should get a character named, that could be like a Kenny or something, right? A Scalzi that is in a dire situation where it seems obvious this person should die and they never do. Like,
so so I have a reading project that I'm doing this year. My New Year's resolution was to read 100 books this year and to alternate books by men and women. To have gender parity, to be 50% or better books by women. Unfortunately, this last month I was doing that. I read 2 graphic novels where the writer was a man, but also the artist was a man, and so that technically counts as 2 male authors. I need to have the next 3 books I read be by women, and then I can read a book by a man again.
Have you read Bitch Planet yet?
I've read the first issue of Bitch Planet. Kelly Sue is a friend of mine.
I was going to say, that seems...
And one of the graphic novels, like the last book I read, was Sex Criminals, written by her husband Chip Zdarsky and illustrated by her husband Matt Fraction, and illustrated by not her husband Chip Zdarsky. So, like right now, I'm reading Two Girls Fat and Thin by Mary Gateskill, which is a novel from 1991. But the next 2 novels I'm going to read after that are both new novels. One of them very new. It just came out last month. Persona by Genevieve Valentine. It's a novel about diplomacy and assassination attempts, but in a world where like diplomacy is sort of like the Miss World competition, where like there are sort of like fashion model considerations for how countries represent each other. The last time I gave a book recommendation on the podcast, I think a year ago, I mentioned it was the day that her last book, The Girls at the Kingfisher Club, came out, and I read that recently, and it was a masterpiece. And so I'm really looking forward to this.
I may have to read it or get the audio version, because if it's been on the podcast twice now, that seems like.
Well, this is the first time this has been on the podcast. It just came out, but
you just said her last book, so you've now mentioned it twice.
The Kingfisher Club, yeah. It's based on it's a book about like sisterhood and sort of laboring under the expectations of others and bonds of support between women. But it's an adaptation of the folktale The 12 Dancing Princesses, set in Prohibition-era New York.
Interesting.
Yeah, I really loved it. And the other one is this novel, The Angel of Losses, by Stephanie Feldman. It's sort of a family story that also gets into a lot of Jewish folklore.
Interesting.
I think that like a woman discovers like a journal from a deceased family member that has references to all of these like mythological creatures and like guardians of the like missing letter of the alphabet that would complete the name of God, and she sort of goes on an exploration into Jewish folklore, as I understand it. This book just won the Crawford Award, and I just met the author, and she was great, and so I bought a copy of her novel, and I'm looking forward to it.
And what does the Crawford Award mean?
The Crawford Award is an award that's given out at the International Conference of the Fantastic in the Arts every year. I believe it's an award for a first book of fantasy. So like it's an annual award given to a first book of fantasy, and I believe Stephanie Feldman was the co-winner this year with a foreign author, a non-American author, whose name is kind of shamefully escaping me right now. But yeah, these two recent novels by women, after the Mary Gateskill novel I'm reading right now, and then I can read another novel by a man.
All right.
Yeah, I'm trying to read two books a week.
Although to be fair, as a writer, I would expect the level of reading you want to do, that is part of your craft, right? That's how you keep yourself sharp. So
I will say it is really biting into my television watching time. Like I sort of took a break to watch the Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt this past week.
I've heard about that. That's I heard some interesting. It gets into funny territory when something is progressive, feminist wise, and then kind of regressive when it comes to race, and that's always
this is what people are talking about it. But I'm just glad that there's another Tina Fey show out there.
Yeah,
it tickles a little of what I loved about 30 Rock, and I have had a 30 Rock shaped hole in my heart these many years now.
So that was a quote I had on Twitter. I probably won't be able to find it. I hope I can for the notes, though, where I said, so I have access to like all of the media ever produced of all time. So what do you want to watch? I was like, want to rewatch 30 Rock? I was like, yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I've done that many times. Like for several years, 30 Rock was my like depression television. Like, am I feeling sad? I better watch some 30 Rock.
And then get sad because 30 Rock's done. So
yeah, well, until I had watched the entire series 4 or 5 times, I could still get There are some series that I've just watched the whole series too many times to ever watch again. 30 Rock, House MD, or the first 5 seasons of House, the good ones.
How much is Cal Penn on those?
Cal Penn is in seasons 4 and 5.
Okay. Because I actually just heard him he's a fascinating person. I just heard him on the Nerdist podcast, and he was talking about being on House, which was interesting.
Yeah, and he left to go work for the Obama administration, so they had his character commit suicide.
It's kind of sour grapes on the part. You don't put the character on a bus. That's the nice thing to do, right?
I mean, I don't know. I think that it was sort of a sudden shock to them when he left, and I don't know if it was sour grapes, but they just wanted it to be final. They were like, you can't come back, right? Like if you do this. And they were worried that, he said he was going to go work for the president, but what if he was just going to be on another TV show somewhere else and was using this to get out of his contract? And he did, in fact, actually go work for the president. But, yeah.
That's I don't know. I get into weirdness about killing people off in books, the reasons why, and, it
was a shocking development when it happened on the show. It came out, like, I believe that the episode title where, Kuttner, his character, commits suicide is called No Reason. And the whole thing is House trying to use his deductive mind to figure out why he committed suicide and not being able to come up with it because there is no reason. And then it just fades to black with a message with like a listing of like the suicide hotline number, which is sort of like, I think, good in some ways, but not particularly. Like it was a case of them trying to do something. Trying to do something pro-social, albeit a little bit heavy-handed and a little bit unnuanced with sort of the situation that had been given to them, I think.
There is, I do love the kind of the white male, and even though I am a minority, I still fall in this too. I find where you've got like the like in power group being like, we did it, we solved sexism, we solved this problem. They like do one poster or something like, we did it, good job, and you're like, you look at them and you're just kind of like, nice try, like for a 5-year-old, I guess. So
Coney 2013 or whatever that was.
Which was that?
Or Coney 20. You remember when there was that like viral? It's like, hey, there's a guy in Africa you've never heard of named Coney, but he's really bad, and we can stop him through the power of Twitter.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
I actually, I'll go on a slight tangent here on that. I actually find it slightly freeing that the term slacktivism. Wow, I'm just getting pronunciations wrong all over the place, which is something my producer on the Box Score Geek Show brings up a lot. This idea, you go on the internet, you want to feel good. You're like, rights in Africa. And you're like, you realize Africa's like giant and there are lots of countries and there are lots of different places. There are lots of different problems. You're just kind of, you're not saying anything. I actually find it slightly freeing to realize that it is harder to make an impact than people think. Because if it was as easy as people want it to be to just go on the Twitter and yell at someone, go on the Twitter, man, I'm getting old. Go on Twitter and yell at someone, that would actually make your life very terrifying because it would mean every action you did had very real and huge consequences. Like actually, I hadn't thought about this like as a science fiction premise, and this kind of came up in Red Shirts, this idea of when you're living within the narrative.
Yeah.
Imagine being a hero in a story where everything you do just reverberates out, has huge ramifications, right? Like if you look at Star Wars as a story, these characters shape the universe doing anything. And it's like, think about living that life. It's like, where do you go for breakfast? Oh, well, because you went there for breakfast, you know that there's going to be an assassination attempt, right? So the act of deciding where to eat for breakfast has more weight than like hours and hours of work on somebody else's part. So I actually find it freeing that that's not the case, that when I go and buy coffee in the morning, yes, there is a system in place that probably supports evil organizations, but me not buying coffee or me buying coffee does not make such a large impact that I kill someone directly.
Right. I had a classics professor in college who talked about this with relation to the Greek myths and the notion of fate within the Greek myths. And that the notion of fate was not necessarily as we normally think of it, but that it was often narrative fate. Like, this person is destined to have, vaguely defined effect on the world. Well, this person is destined to have vaguely defined effect on the world because they are a mythic figure, i.e. they are someone we are telling a myth about, i.e. if they didn't have a great effect on the world, we would not be telling a myth about them. There's this sort of self-referential notion to narrative fate.
I'm trying to think, I'm going to mess up the quote, but it goes, the character is not in the story because they're special. They're special because they're in the story.
Could be. I haven't heard that before.
But like that, the exact point you're saying, it's like the second the narrator puts a lens on a character, right?
Yeah.
You have immediately said, this person is special for a reason, but it's because they're in your story. It's like they may be normal, they may not matter. So it's like there's nothing necessarily intrinsically special about that person, but by putting them in the story, you have now elevated them to be
right. Or like the idea, a happy ending is a consequence of where you choose to stop the story.
We talked that about the adventures of Cavalier and Clay. I wanted to say Cassius and Clay because I'd been reading about Muhammad Ali recently, and I was like, that ain't right. But when we talked about that, where I basically said, if you read the entire book, there's enough in the future where you realize the book, spoiler alert for Cavalier and Clay, the book ends on a downer, but based on what the narrator has told us, he could have basically fast forwarded 2 years, and it could have ended the book on a happy note. And the same,
like the notion of an ending is itself a narrative invention. Like we don't get endings in life. There are no. One of the books that I read last year that I really enjoyed was a book by Michelle Hunovan called Blame. And one of the things I love about it is it takes place over decades. Um, and there are lots of plot threads in it, many of which are just dropped, many of which never achieve any kind of resolution, which was a sort of narratively daring choice for Michelle Hunnivan to make, and it created this sort of knotted narrative where there are just like ends coming out, but it seemed to me to aesthetically capture something that felt more true to life in its tangles than a more traditionally structured narrative might have.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I find, yeah, that happens in real life all the time, where it's like you're really interested in something. It is the focal point of your life. If someone was writing what was like, if someone was looking at the lens I thought my life was going through and what was important, was trying to write that story, like that person would eventually just get upset, as if they were a showrunner, would just be like, you are so schizo about this. It's like, make up your damn mind. Like, is this a romantic comedy? Is this a drama? In narrative, we get used to like I said, your book, that I don't even know if it's a criticism. It's just how my brain worked, because the way you started your story, this crazy cult leader person that is, sterilizing these young girls with a condition, and you have a pregnant mother that has interviewed him, pregnant soon-to-be mother that has interviewed him and is now going on a trip. My brain set that up immediately as like a horror or action story. I'm like, EJ is putting the path EJ has put this character on. This character is going into harm. What is going to happen to her? And that wasn't what happened at all. Obviously, as we mentioned, spoilers. We just heard us talk for an hour about it.
Right.
But like that, like my brain put it in that mode, and for like the first 15 pages of your book, I think it's about 30 to 40, depending. I was just sitting here like, what's going to happen to her? What's going to happen to her? Who's going to kidnap her? Who's going to, I couldn't get myself out of that mindset, because we're used to books being very focused when reality, right, is very jumbled.
Yeah, you're not the first person to say that the opening made them sort of prepared them for a horror story, which is interesting. I wanted the scene that she's describing in that opening section to feel horrific, because I think it's a horrific thing that Reverend Kenny Kendall does. But I always, when I was writing it, I always felt Tess as being someone who's very insulated from it. And when she's reflecting on her talk with him, I had intended that as foreshadowing for her sense of complicity in what happens with Candace and her daughters, the girls who get sterilized. But it hadn't occurred to me at the time that the tonal connection between those two things would sort of create this sense of horror. But you're not the first person to tell me that that's what they got from it, so it's very interesting.
I'm glad I get to use this anecdote twice in a week, and it's about WrestleMania. So, went to WrestleMania with Brian Foster, the Box Score Geek show. I love wrestling. It's kind of a weird build that's happened. It's actually been almost taking an English class on wrestling. So looking at the history, looking at things like kayfabe, I hope I said that right. It's the idea of keeping the word, pretending it's real when it's not, kind of the way narratives build, heels, faces, this kind of stuff. It's basically a form of performance art that has a bunch of rules that you get used to. And so we were watching at WrestleMania. There's a scene where The Rock and Ronda Rousey, I hope I'm saying her name right, she's a UFC fighter, showed up. And after it was done, I was talking to Brian about it, and he said, I liked it, but I felt really uncomfortable. He said, I just felt kind of weird when it was done. And I actually explained from Steve Martin's Born Standing Up why, which was, we get used to action, we get used to beats and jokes. That's what Steve Martin talks about. And so what you basically have is you have the setup, the build, the punch. That's the very, knock, knock, who's there? A chicken who dances, ha, 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 ha. You're supposed to laugh there, even though that was clearly just formulaic and doesn't mean anything. But one of the things Steve Martin said he would do is he would build a joke, but he wouldn't give that release. That release is supposed to be there, but he wouldn't build it, and he would just build and build and build and build, and people would start like nervously laughing because they were like, I know I'm supposed to laugh here, but you haven't said and a purple penguin or whatever.
Right.
And so there was an action beat with The Rock and Ronda against Triple H and Stephanie McMahon, who I'm sure you're a huge fan of all of them, that it just kept building and building and building and building and building and didn't have the release at the right spot. And so I was like, that's why. There was another act between Sting and Triple H. I'm going to lose like everybody. It's like for the people that didn't like sports, that like sci-fi, I'm all like wrestling. I'm like, get off my show, get off my lawn.
Band your horizons, audience. We'll talk about what we want.
But basically what kept happening was every like 10 minutes, a nostalgic person from the 90s would show up in the act. So it'd be like Sting and Triple H are fighting and Sting's got the upper hand. But here, for those of you that know, DX arrives. And you're like, oh my God, and the audience goes crazy. And I'm the person on Twitter being like, yeah, whatever. And then later it's like, and NWO arrives. And you're like, yeah. And then Shawn Michaels. And it's like, you're conditioned by things to know when you're supposed to cheer. And I think basically what you just ran into is it has become a very well-worn trope, the kind of scary religious figure, the kind of scary cult thing. We've been trained to know in books, this signifies you're in a horror thing. Like that you kind of start sanitary, right? You kind of start with like, it seems a little off, but it seems normal, but we know this is supposed to weird us out. And that like Kevin Smith did that with Red State. He followed that trope beginning to end, even though he claims, and this is true, he kept zigging when he thought the audience was onto him. But so I think that's the only reason there, and it's not your fault, right? It's just that there's an entire body of literature that says creepy reverend means horror story.
Right.
And because when the book opens, right, and I mean, I actually love that. I mean, you get more points for that, right? Subverting tropes in narratives is something I'm a fan of, because I find it gets very lazy. And I was actually writing about this on WrestleMania. I was like, I'm actually annoyed that in wrestling right now, narrative-wise, the authors are more comfortable bringing up things the audience is comfortable with, basically people that were popular in the 90s, to tell the audience you're supposed to be happy, as opposed to trying to tell good stories. And for me, I don't like that. It feels lazy.
Interesting. I have never watched wrestling, so... Well, like in video games, right? You see Nintendo sort of bringing the same characters back again and again and again, rather than making new and interesting properties. I think their last new and interesting property was Pikmin. And Pikmin was
that long ago, because I was in high school when that came out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of a more recent Nintendo franchise than Pikmin, and they keep adding more people to Smash Brothers. They keep making new Mario games. They keep making new Zelda games. They keep, trying to ruin Metroid. But I can't think of a more recent sort of like completely original concept than Pikmin. And people who criticize Nintendo as a first-party developer, like this is what they usually criticize them for, is the idea of that they're treading too heavily on nostalgia. And not heavily enough on invention and new ideas. I'm
loving the fact that in the show notes I'm going to get to compare Nintendo to the WWE, because it's true. Like, I mean, it's like, I know I'm happy, right? I'm happy that Shawn Michaels shows up. That's great. And does sweet chin music is the move. It's where he kicks the person in the head. It's like, well, that's nice. But it's like, you doing that is very kind of just lazy and not wanting to write your own narratives. And so interesting, like, I'm a huge Zelda fan, and here's something that bugs me. You know, a fantastic story you can do in the Zelda universe if you want to just do another Zelda? I would love to see something called Sheik's Tale, if I hope I'm pronouncing it right. It's Sheik or Sheik in Ocarina of Time. They have a fantastic story there that we know nothing about, because for those of you that haven't played Ocarina of Time, one of the best games of all time, in my opinion, Link basically goes to sleep for, I think, 7 years. And in that time, Ganondorf, who I've now become very closely attached to as an avatar, takes power. And Zelda in that time manages to escape from Ganondorf, get training by some basically sand people, learn magic and stuff, and learn enough stuff to try and help Link on his quest to overthrow Ganondorf. I want to know what happened. And that could be a fantastic video game. Tell that story.
You should look up so an artist who I really like, webcomic artist named Aaron Diaz. He does webcomic under the name Dresden Kodak. Was inspired by the first Anita Sarkeesian video, and he did sort of a concept development for a Zelda-focused entry in the Zelda franchise called Clockwork Empire. Search for Zelda Clockwork Empire. You will like what you find.
I'm very excited already. Because yeah, I mean, it seems to me, even if you're going to tread on, like, if you're going to tread on nostalgia, that's fine. But I think one of my favorite, we've talked about this guy before. His name is Christopher Straub, and one of his points, he kind of argued against memes. And what he basically points out is, if you're, the great artists steal, like, good artists copy, great artists steal. That everybody uses that line. I believe Abraham Lincoln said it. But basically, if you're going to take art or something, you have to build on it. You have to add on it. And so many people don't do that. They just know, like I said, they know, like, knock, knock, who's there. They take the joke as is. They put it in their own work, and they think people are supposed to laugh because it's there. And it's like, yeah, for Zelda, it's like, if you're going to build on nostalgia, well, build on it. Don't just tell the exact same story again and again and again. So kind of my take.
Yeah, let's update. It's the same game that you played in 1994, but now on a handheld with better graphics and better sound. Buy it. And I often do buy it, but people are critical of this. People are critical of the video game industry for trading too much in nostalgia. People are critical of some ends of the comics industry for trading too much on nostalgia and not as much on sort of original narrative. And so I guess it doesn't surprise me, knowing what I now do about wrestling, that this same problem and same criticism can come up there.
What's hilarious in all of those mediums is that what basically happens is someone comes up with an idea that at the time people are like, this is a dumb idea. Are you crazy? And the person goes, no, I think we should try it. And it's new and it's novel and it comes out and everybody loves it because it's novel and it's crazy. Like, the original Mario Brothers, people were like, what, a plumber who's fighting a donkey, or not a donkey, a gorilla, or whatever. So this thing explodes. It's novel. It's new.
Donkey Kong, but sure.
Donkey Kong, yeah. Okay.
The original Mario Brothers they were running in pipes and bumping turtles from below.
I thought he did. Okay, I thought Mario showed up in Donkey Kong. Anyway, so sorry.
Well, he did as a character named. This is the dumbest goddamn conversation. He did as a character named Jumpman, but then they reused that character, named it Mario Brother. Did the Mario Brothers, which I think was an arcade thing, and then the one that became big was Super Mario Brothers, which was the launch title for the Famicom.
Excellent. Okay. But so, like, this thing comes out.
I'm not sure about that. It was the launch title for the Famicom, which was renamed the Nintendo Entertainment System in the United States, anyway.
Yep. And the original Famicom, getting more into Zelda, had a microphone on the controller, so there were characters in the original Zelda game you could shout at, and it would respond to that. Yeah. So the English instructions confused users because it said shout at these characters to make them go away, and you couldn't in America. But yeah, these things come out. They're new. They're novel. Everybody says, "Oh, we love them. They're so new and novel," and then they just copy them forever. And so it's always amazing when you see that, where it's basically like, why are we doing this story? Well, because everybody loves it. Well, why does everybody love it? Oh, because when it came out, it was really new and novel, and that's what made it catch on. And then everybody told everybody else it was the best thing for the rest of their lives. So
right. Well, that's what was that? Was it something like a Henry Ford quotation? If I tried to give people what they wanted, I would have given them a faster horse.
Yep.
Something like that. Which I think I know of as quoted by Steve Jobs with reference to market research and his opinion that, like, no, it's not the consumer's job to know what they want. It's our job to know what they want and come up with it. And,
I think it's also just acceptable to make it not such a crime to try new things. I feel that's one of the issues, and I don't know as much about, like, the writing and entertainment game, but I feel that we are too harsh on new people that try stuff and fail, especially in, like, big things, because I feel like on television shows and in movies, there's so many moving parts that dictate why it succeeds or not, that to have someone fail one time is not a justification to never try something new again or try something in the same vein again.
So tying this back into sports, this is how I felt about the criticism of the Mike D'Antoni Phoenix teams back in the day. On the one hand, I kind of adored how every year they ran into the Spurs and every year the Spurs beat them. There was that year they finally swept the Spurs.
With a little help. Let's not let Spurs fans write history in their own image. There was a year where Amari Stoudemire jumped off the bench and was suspended in the playoffs, and that may have had an impact on the playoffs.
Did they not have another game in Phoenix where they had all their players and we were still missing Robert Horry? Did they not also decisively lose that game?
This is like fan couple. There's been research on this where you have fan teams and they see things different. They literally see things differently than a third-party observer does, and this may be a case of that. Up there with Lakers fans who probably believe that even after Tim Duncan's three.
I'm going to say this. Between Manu's foul on Dirk Nowitzki in 2006 and the Derek Fisher's 0.4 second shot in 2004 and goddamned Ray Allen's three-pointer in 2013, the Spurs can have that Phoenix series.
All right. Okay. So sorry, I interrupted you. So you were talking sports, the D'Antoni team.
Choose which one of those three unbelievable, unlikely playoff endings, heartbreaks you want to use, and we'll just say that balances out the Phoenix one, and that leaves us with the two remaining.
All right.
Karma is still on the Spurs side. Damn it.
I still can't, because we actually did get into sports. I can't believe I tweeted this out last night. This was like an easy. I knew it was an auto retweet from you. Spurs are going to go 18 years consecutive winning 50-plus games. That's just absurd. Yeah. All right, so the D'Antoni Phoenix Suns.
Yeah, so but he was doing the run and gun thing, the 7 seconds or less. That was a completely new thing, had not been tried before in the NBA, and they had phenomenal success with it. When they would lose to the Spurs every year, like what he was criticized for was like, oh yeah, well sure, it works really well in the regular season, but obviously you can't win a championship doing that. I'm not convinced that you can't win a championship doing that. It hasn't been done yet, but he was the only one trying it, and he only had one team to go into the finals with.
There's also there were like there are three major things about it too. One year, Joe Johnson, who was actually, he wasn't a great player, but he was a really good shooter on that team, which is a huge part of their success. Ended up getting his face broken. We had Paul.
His orbital bone.
So he only played about half of the playoffs, and they lost in the conference finals. Then there was the year where they basically played the Spurs, which is already right. The annoying thing about playing another good team is basically you take your odds of winning a title and you cut it somewhere between 40 and 60%. Right? You basically just accept either of these teams.
This is why Cleveland are still the favorites for the title, even though obviously Golden State is the best team in the league because Golden State has to go through the West.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the other favorite. So there was the Amari thing, and then there's just playing in the West. So it's like, to me, it seems really absurd to look at the Suns and say, well, they didn't win a title, never copy them again, than what you're saying, which is to say, hey, this team had some success amid some other odds, maybe we could try it again.
Yeah, I mean, they went to the conference finals twice, and were always first or second in terms of record in the league for those years. They did really well, but the criticism was, but you can't win a title that way. They used to say the criticism of the Spurs in the '90s was always, well, you're never going to win a title with Avery Johnson as your point guard, which was true until they did. I'm not necessarily even defending Avery Johnson as a good point guard. I'm just saying it's a stupid criticism. It's a post hoc criticism. It's saying, oh, they haven't done it, therefore it's not doable.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, Patrick and I, we've talked a lot about this on the Box Score Geek show. It's like trying new stuff, especially if the cost is low. Like, it is really expensive to hire a veteran player in the NBA. It's really expensive to spend $5+ million a year for a multi-year contract for a player in their 30s that is on the decline. That is not. I think it's worth it for a player that's been a star. If they haven't been a star, you're just making a risk. It is really cheap to get a D-League player that's looked phenomenal, and on a team that's not going to the playoffs, to give them more minutes. That is the cheapest thing you can do, and it is remarkable how many teams at the end of the season will just hire veteran guys, tank the season, and hope that they can get the number one pick.
Right. Well, I think it's the NBA version of nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, are you familiar with that?
Oh yeah, we've talked that on the Box Score Geek show several times.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, oh, well, this person has been a player on an NBA team. So if I, hire this person, I know I have an NBA player. Whereas if I hire someone from the D League and they don't cut it, what was I thinking? I could have hired an NBA player.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that's the major change that needs to happen. And that's why it's hard, because it has to happen at the top, is you need to get executives and studio heads and not GMs, sports owners that basically go, most things fail. I'm more comfortable with familiar things, but that does not inherently make them better. Maybe we can try new things. It doesn't always have to. Like, that's the other thing. Like, you don't always have, you can hire 8 guys on your team the conventional method, and then 2 guys the unconventional method. Give them a try. And, worst things worse, you fail and you're where you already at.
Right. Like, my favorite article about Greg Popovich to come out in the last few years was the one that said, we keep trying to characterize what Greg Popovich is doing, and we've gotten it wrong because we've been looking at the wrong level. Like, when he first took over, we characterized him as this great defensive coach, and now we're characterizing him as this brilliant offensive coach. And we characterized him as this internationalophile. No, actually, the way we should be characterizing him is he has a great mind for where the market inefficiencies in the NBA are. He just has a really intuitive sense of what is now getting overplayed and where he should move to be in the region where he still has a competitive advantage. And as that shifts over the years, our old characterization of this is what he's good at changes, because that was never what he was doing. What he was doing was, how can I take the personnel I have and use them in a way that takes advantage of a basketball inefficiency.
And that's what you need to do. And that's one of the things that I think people miss about Moneyball, is everybody just takes it to be like, math people looked at sports with math. The real story of Moneyball was what you're saying, find market inefficiencies. And I don't think enough people in sports do that. I think too many people are on the train of, I'm going to see sports in a new way, and that's going to give me a new understanding and insight. And pretty much it's the Warren Buffett, when everybody's buying, sell, when everybody's selling, buy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this article expressed it in terms of gambling, and that Greg Popovich was sort of the best bettor in the NBA, and that he had the gambler's feel for when things were going to get valuable. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a statement about being perceptive to market inefficiencies.
And that's what, one of the things, you talk Steve Jobs, one of the interesting things about like the iPad, for instance, is Microsoft had tried that like 3 times leading up to it. Go watch an old Star Trek episode. Everybody in the late 80s, early 90s thought that this was going to be the future of the 90s, and nobody did it. And it wasn't until the 2000s it took off. And it's just like, sometimes you just have to wait until the market's in the right spot for something to be.
Well, also, you look at, like, there's this YouTube video with him and Bill Gates talking, and Bill Gates is talking about how he thinks tablet computers are going to be the future. And he's showing, Windows Mobile Tablet Edition and the stylus-based interface, and Jobs is sort of dismissive of it, because the reason that it took off wasn't because the hardware was bad. The reason that it took off wasn't because the market wasn't ready for it. The reason that Microsoft failed wasn't because the hardware was bad or the market wasn't ready for it. The reason Microsoft failed with tablet computers was they were incredibly married to their Windows first strategy, which meant they were not going to launch a product that did not run Windows, which meant they were not going to launch a product that did not use a desktop metaphor for human interface. What Apple did was they reconceived the human interface to be entirely touch, non-stylus at all based interface, and to get rid of the desktop metaphor. iOS doesn't have a desktop metaphor, and now none of the major mobile operating systems use a desktop metaphor. Even when they tried to marry one into Windows, they did it. But even when they tried to remake Windows for mobile in light of the iPhone and iPad success, they did it by hiding the desktop. What Apple realized was that the desktop metaphor doesn't work for touch-based devices.
Yeah, it makes me really sad. So I'll give another example. But I bought like a little pedometer, which you'll notice is not on my wrist, and I thought it was kind of cool. And I bought it, and right after I bought it, I was just like, this is horribly designed, because first off, the band, it was really hard to get on the wrist. like the little straps were really weak, so it was easy for them to fall off. To charge it, I couldn't have it on and charge it. I had to take it off and charge it. And, and then it just wasn't comfortable. So I was like, the main thing you should have thought about with this device was how to make a comfortable watch that's easy to put on that I could, have on my desk and charge. And you didn't do that. You were so focused on having a device that could like read the sun and read my pulse and guess my sleep rhythms that you missed that this is basically a nice watch and you need to make this a comfortable watch. And
Right.
So many engineers do that where you give us the specs. I'm pointing at me because I'm a software engineer. You give us the specs and we go, all right, how do we solve these specs? And we don't think like, how are the people that are going to use this going to interact with this? And it makes me sad. It's a common problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, Microsoft was there first in a lot of ways, but their unwillingness to invent a new operating system for the problem, to reimagine how people were actually going to use the device, I think is what kept them from getting there, 5 years earlier.
I think a major problem in Silicon Valley, and something that I'm liking about like you making sure that you read books by both female and male authors, is when your entire staff is mid-20s males, they're going to view the problem through the lenses of mid-20s males, and in a lot of ways. So like that was something about these. The reason a bunch of Google engineers can't conceive of how to make good tablets is because all of us say, well, computers are fine. Like I have my desktop, I have my 32-inch monitor, I have a mouse, I can do all this. Why would I ever need something this simple? They don't think about it through the eyes of like an 80-year-old who just wants to like surf the web.
Yeah, and God, an iPad is just the best computer for an 80-year-old.
Well, okay, so we got that. I'm good. I think basically what I'm just going to plan on. And by the way, I'm viewing this as like practice for me because this is me learning how to interview a famous author, and I'm hoping that your success keeps building, and I'll have them more and more polished. Yeah, whatever. Go ahead and be your book or novella. Sorry, I keep saying book. Your novella is on the cover of a magazine. That is an impressive feat. Feel free to be humble. I know that a lot of success is luck and not always in our hands. But
I mean, the thing about being on the cover of Asimov's is a really big deal to a really tiny subgroup of humanity, and I'm happy to be a member of that subgroup. I feel very good about myself that I achieved that, but I think it's a really good story, and I think that anyone who likes reading fiction and who enjoys good stories could get a lot out of it. But I mostly just hope it gets readers.
That actually is a really fantastic cover.
I know, I love it so much. If you stayed here through all the talk about Apple and Microsoft and basketball and wrestling and John Scalzi and you initially signed in for The New Mother, well, here it is again. This is what it looks like. You can buy it in print and online.
Yeah, I really hope your and my podcasts have the Kevin Smith feel of like every time the audience is on board with the subject, we just jump them off. And yeah, we get that weird Venn diagram. There's one person that's like, I like wrestling and sci-fi and sports and Apple. It's a weird combination.
Whittle down the audience until we've got that one ideal listener, and then we can arrange to meet in some city and get coffee, I guess.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm hoping I'm in a lucky enough situation to be going through Texas at some point, and I'll definitely buy you a coffee. And yeah, we'll want to hear more about future writings, etc.
I will let you know.
All right, so I'm going to let that be the wrap-up of the show. It's kind of weird because I've been used to the Box Score Geek show, and I guess this is an offshoot. But our special guest has been Eugene E.J. Fischer, author of The New Mother, which you can find in this month's edition of Asimov magazine. It is the April-May, is that correct?
Yeah, April-May 2015.
The April-May 2015 special double issue. Buy it in print, buy it on your Kindle, buy it on your computer, buy it wherever you can.